We're going to start this lesson by going to File, Open, navigating to the desktop, Exercise Files, Chapter 3, and we're going to open up Mass Chaos, and it's as cool as it sounds. Whoa, look at that. There's just stuff everywhere. There's a little bit of everything in this project. We have some spheres, some tubes, lights, a shape, wind, bones, all sorts of crazy stuff going on here. Now, because of that, it's hard to find what I'm looking for. And this presents a significant problem because in order to edit objects in Max, we usually have to select them first. I've skirted around this topic a little bit, but let's head into what selecting really does. Now, I can go to the Modify column, but Max doesn't know what to modify. We first have to select something, and then Max can modify it. Let's take, for example, this sphere over here. I'm just going to click it to select it. And by the way, I'm using the default selection tool to do that. But you could also use one of the 3 transform tools. Now, we've talked about them a little bit, and we typically do just use them for moving, rotating, and scaling, respectively. But as you'll notice the name as we hang our mouse over and see that tooltip, these tools are actually called Select and Move, Select and Rotate, and Select and Uniform Scale. So if you have one of these transforms selected, you could also use them to select and then make your transformations as well. When an object is selected, its wireframe turns white. I'm going to pan around here to show you that when an object is selected in the perspective view, as long as the perspective view is in smooth and highlights mode, you will see the corners of a white bounding box here. We'll also see the name of the selected object show up in the Modify column, and that's how we can tell something is selected. Now, when a scene starts getting really crazy like this, sometimes just clicking on an object is not feasible. So let me show you some other tools for selecting. Let me show you about these region select tools here. By default, this one is selected, which is basically a rectangular selection region, meaning that not only can I click on something and select it, but I can also click and drag a marquee, and everything within that marquee will also be selected. As I click and drag this down, we'll see other shapes to choose from. I can choose this tool to select using a circle. I can choose this one to create a fence around the objects that I want to select. So I can click, and click, and click, and click, and click, and just select the objects that I want to select. Double click to complete the selection. There's a little bit more control there. Let me show you one of my favorite. Down here at the bottom, there is this paint selection. So I get this little cursor, and as I click and drag, everything under it gets selected. I'm not really sure how useful that is, but it's dang fun. I'm just going to click on nothing to deselect everything. And I'm also going to reset this back to the rectangular selection region tool. You need to be aware of this button. This is the window crossing button. Now, typically by default, I'm just going to use the wheel mouse to zoom in here. Typically, by default, the way this is set up is that if I drag a marquee and I barely touch this object, it will select it still. And as you can see, this icon for window crossing is showing us that behavior. This box, like this one, represents a selection area. And this little donut looking thing is kind of like an object. So if we have it like this, then our selection region just has to barely touch the object to select it. If we click this button, you'll notice that the icon changes significantly. The object is now completely encompassed by the selection region. Well, that's how this works. If I were to click outside all objects to deselect them, and then click and drag as before, and notice my marquee is still touching the blue sphere, I let go and nothing is selected. In order to select, with this button pressed down, I have to encompass the entire object. And you might be wondering, well, why is that helpful? Well, this is a good case of it. If I let go now, the only thing that will be selected is the sphere. However, if I didn't have it selected, and I went like this to select the sphere, every object underneath this selection region will be selected. So if you have a really hectic scene like this one, hitting this window crossing button can be an effective solution for you. Let me show you one other one that I use all the time. I'm going to click to deselect first. This is the Select by Name button. We use it to select our objects by their names. Now, if you have a huge scene with tons of stuff going on, this might be the only viable option for selecting something. So handy is it, in fact, that I use the letter H, which is the keyboard shortcut for the Select by Name dialog box, to launch it. I had a professor once that referred to it as the hit list, and that helped him to remember the keyboard shortcut for Select by Name. So I'm going to hit the letter H on the keyboard for hit list to bring that up. And here we have a list of all the objects in our scene that are not hidden. We'll talk about how to hide objects in the next segment. But now we can just look at this and pick what we want. I want to select Wind 01. It's a wind system. It's a type of space warp. And now I can just hit select, and now wind is selected. I'm going to hit H again to get back there. Now you'll notice that my naming conventions here, or lack thereof, are very distracting. I have 4 spheres. Who knows which is which? I don't know. So I got a pink one, a blue one, a yellow one. Looks like another kind of pink one back here. I don't know which one is sphere 01 or 2 or 3. I might have when I initially made them. If I only had 3 spheres in my scene, I might be able to keep track of which one's 1, 2, or 3. But as I start adding complexity, I can't remember that. So you gotta name your objects. It's so critical that you do that. Or otherwise you're going to be sitting here having no clue what's going on in your scene. Trust me on this one, folks. This is a workflow that you need to get into. And naming objects is absolutely easy. So I'm going to hit cancel here, show you how to do this real quick. I'm going to select this sphere. I just have to go to the Modify tab in the Command panel, select its current name, Sphere 03, and type whatever I want to call it, blue sphere. Now when I hit the letter H to get to the Select by Name dialog, blue sphere is right there. Blue sphere is easily identifiable because I named it properly. Now, this little section over here helps quite a bit. If I'm looking for a type of geometry, a sphere or something, I don't need to look at all this confusing stuff. I could simply hit none. I don't want to look at for any of these things. And then just hit the geometry checkbox. And all of the geometry, all those objects in my scene will show up. Let's say I'm looking for a light. I can turn off geometry and turn on lights. Do the same thing with cameras, helpers, space warps. Or I could do them together. And I could invert it too. Let's say I wanted everything except shapes, cameras, and space warps. I could just hit invert, and those are the only ones that are not selected. There's similar functionality on the left-hand side here. Let's say we wanted to select everything except the blue sphere. All I have to do is come down here and hit the invert button, and everything but the blue sphere is selected. There are other ways to do this, but I find that this is the most efficient way. Okay, so now that we know how to select objects, and now that we know how to name them properly, we're ready to get into the final stage of navigating through Max, and that is freezing and hiding objects.